The EU shares your concern that the human rights, humanitarian and security situations are deteriorating quickly, with indiscriminate attacks against civilian population precipitating mass displacement. This threatens the lives of many thousands in Myanmar. The Special Advisor for Prevention of Genocide recently warned that accountability must be ensured to deter more atrocity crimes. We reiterate our support to the mandate of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. We would welcome your views on how your office can contribute to the existing accountability efforts, including through cooperation with other mechanisms, and what your current priorities are in this regard.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sweden on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We welcome the update by the High Commissioner on Myanmar and echo the concerns for a deepening humanitarian emergency. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the coup in Myanmar and the military's use of deadly violence against peaceful protesters and call for the systematic repression of civil and political rights to immediately end. The international community must refrain from any measures that risk lending legitimacy to the military regime. All arbitrarily arrested must be released, including political leaders. Internet and media restrictions and shutdowns must be lifted. We are also worried about the impact on and protection needs of women and girls, especially sexual and gender-based violence, and on the worsening situation for the Rohingyas and other minorities. It is imperative to ensure accountability for the most serious international crimes and violations of international law. We reiterate our strong support for the IIMM and underline the importance of access to all UN bodies and international mechanisms to Myanmar. Madam High Commissioner, how can the international community promote dialogue to get Myanmar back on the path to democracy? I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. The OIC expresses grave concern at continuing reports of serious human rights violations against Rohingyas in Myanmar, even during the COVID pandemic. The OIC is further concerned about the lack of implementation of provisional measures in Myanmar ordered by the International Court of Justice. The OIC urges Myanmar to end immediately all violence and violations of human rights against Rohingyas, strictly follow the ICJ's provisional measures, cooperate with all independent national, regional and international criminal justice and judicial mechanisms, as well as with the UN and its relevant human rights mechanism, implement all recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, including restoring citizenships of Rohingyas without any delay, and finally immediately commence repatriation of forcibly displaced Rohingyas. To conclude, the OIC highly recommends the remarkable ongoing efforts made by Bangladesh in providing temporary shelter, humanitarian assistance, protection to Rohingyas. The OIC calls on the High Commissioner and her office to continue its advocacy and work in support of the resolution of Rohingya crisis, including the dignified and early return of Rohingyas from Bangladesh to Myanmar. The international community should not shy away from its responsibility to stand by Rohingyas until a lasting solution is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany for a video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update. Germany continues to condemn in the strongest terms the military coup and the continued brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters, as well as the oppression of everyone opposing the coup. We reiterate our call to release all those detained and express our solidarity with the people of Myanmar. We also remain deeply concerned by the human rights situation of the Rohingya and other minorities. Human rights must be respected. We support the central efforts by ASEAN on the basis of the 5-point consensus to reach both a peaceful solution based on an inclusive dialogue and the immediate cessation of violence. Germany strongly supports the work of the High Commissioner and her office. The very worrying situation on the ground requires continued attention by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council must in particular ensure accountability for all current and future human rights violations. We welcome the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar and all other efforts in this regard. And I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sierra Leone on Zoom.
Madam President, Salon thanked the High Commissioner for all updates on the situation in Myanmar, which has unfortunately not improved since Myanmar's review earlier this year. Salon remains deeply concerned by the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar, including extensive and systemic violence against Rohingya and other minority groups. We are disappointed by the lack of implementation of the provisional measures in Myanmar as ordered by the ICJ. A delegation deplores the use of force and violence against civilians exercising their human rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. We reiterate our call for humanitarian aid workers and international observers to be granted unrestricted and unfettered access to the country. We urge Myanmar to 1. End the coup and all violence directed against minority groups, including Rohingyas. 2. End violence crackdown against civil society activists, including lawyers, journalists, and unconditionally release those arbitrarily detained. 3. Engage in constructive dialogue with international accountability mechanisms. Salon calls on the High Commissioner and our office to continue its work in Myanmar, including supporting the resolution on Rohingya's crisis and the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of displaced persons. We call on the international community to continue advocating for accountability and justice in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Australia for a video statement.
We welcome this interactive dialogue as an important opportunity for the Council to discuss the concerning human rights situation in Myanmar. It is over 5 months since the military coup in Myanmar, and the death toll and number of arrests continue to rise. Australia urgently calls on the regime to end the horrific violence, immediately release all those arbitrarily detained, and return Myanmar to the path of democracy. We call on the regime to end the incomprehensible attacks on medical personnel and humanitarian workers, on civil society, labour union members and journalists. We also remain deeply concerned about the impact of ongoing conflict on humanitarian crises across Myanmar and the setback the coup poses to prospects for the voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable return of the Rohingya and other displaced persons. The international community cannot lose focus on accountability, including for abuses perpetrated in Rakhine State. Now, more than ever, Australia supports the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and broader efforts to hold the regime to account. Australia will continue to work with others, especially ASEAN, to promote de-escalation, dialogue and a return to democracy in Myanmar. We ask, what more can states do to respond to the increase in instances of arbitrary arrest and detention of political and human rights advocates? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Bangladesh for a video statement.
This is the 4th anniversary of Myanmar's brutal campaign against Rohingyas. For 4 years, Bangladesh has been shouldering the burden of hosting over 1 million Rohingyas despite dwindling aid support. Repatriation is the only viable solution to the crisis. Rohingyas also long for going back to their homeland, Myanmar. Although Bangladesh has done whatever it can to facilitate the repatriation process, the fact is not a single Rohingya has been able to return due to Myanmar's non-cooperation. Myanmar has doubted the repeated calls of the international community. Such blatant disregard warrants global action. The international community must ensure that the root causes of the Rohingya problem are addressed. The flagrant violation of human rights and other heinous crimes committed against Rohingyas are accounted for. Simultaneously, the international community must put pressure on Myanmar to take their people back for the greater interest of regional peace and stability. The current political situation should not detract us from paying due attention to this crisis and seeking a durable solution. Indeed, our posterity will not excuse us if we fail to protect this ill-fated community and ensure their life in safety, security, and dignity in their place of origin. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Indonesia on Zoom.
We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update. Indonesia continues to deeply concerned with the human rights situation in Myanmar. The situation is indeed complex and delicate. But the current predicament regarding representation of the country concerned in our dialogue is also a momentum, not only for the Council, but also the UN system to evaluate the best way to deliberate on this matter. In any setting, as stipulates in the Council founding resolution, state has the duty to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Therefore, the Myanmar military has the duty to prevent violence and refrain from the excessive use of force against civilians, as called upon also in the 5-point consensus reached at ASEAN leaders meeting last April. President, inclusive engagement in human rights dialogue is key, and the Council needs to be informed of the factual developments from relevant stakeholders. Bearing this in mind, Indonesia counts on international community firm support for ASEAN endeavors to seek a peaceful solution by the people of Myanmar. Also to ensure all stakeholders in Myanmar upholds human rights and fundamental freedom. In this regard, High Commissioner, what priority should be given by the UN team presence in the country to support your mandate to further prevent the human rights violation in Myanmar? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to France on Zoom.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Madame la Haute Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour cet exposé très éclairant qui fait écho à nos préoccupations quant à la gravité de la situation en Birmanie. Le coup d'État du 1er février et les nombreuses violations des droits de l'homme observées depuis lors nous obligent à la vigilance, alors que nous reviennent chaque jour du terrain des informations alarmantes qui font craindre un engrenage qui pourrait mener à la guerre civile. Dans ce contexte, il est important que ce dialogue interactif puisse avoir lieu aujourd'hui, en dépit de l'absence de représentation de la Birmanie, dont le siège devra être occupé par une personne représentant les aspirations démocratiques du peuple birman. Comme elle l'a fait à plusieurs reprises depuis le 1er février dernier, la France appelle à la levée de l'état d'urgence, la libération de toutes les personnes arrêtées arbitrairement, au respect de la volonté du peuple birman exprimée librement lors des élections générales de novembre 2020 et au rétablissement de l'état de droit. Alors que la situation humanitaire ne cesse de se dégrader, la France demande à nouveau un accès humanitaire sûr et sans restriction à l'ensemble du territoire, notamment pour aider les personnes déplacées et vulnérables. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, and I advise all delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. I give the floor to Spain for a video statement.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Ante el contenido de la actualización oral que acabamos de escuchar sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Myanmar, España desea manifestar su preocupación especialmente en relación a los casos de detenciones arbitrarias, torturas y ejecuciones extrajudiciales. España condena enérgicamente la supresión del gobierno civil, así como la detención arbitraria del presidente Win Myint, de la consejera de Estado Aung San Suu Kyi, así como de otros cargos políticos, defensores de derechos humanos, periodistas, profesionales de la salud y miembros de la sociedad civil. España reitera de esta forma su preocupación por las violaciones de derechos humanos que se producen diariamente en el país. Nada puede justificar el uso excesivo e indiscriminado de la fuerza ejercida contra civiles inocentes, periodistas y personal médico. En línea con los llamamientos anteriores, lamentamos la ausencia total de colaboración con el relator especial y la prohibición de acceso al país desde 2017, y aprovechamos para ofrecerle a él y a la alta comisionada nuestra máxima colaboración. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Japan for a video statement.
Japan welcomes the 5-point consensus of ASEAN and highly appreciates ASEAN's efforts to break the impasse in Myanmar. It is critical to produce tangible outcomes through the 5-point consensus. Japan will continue to support ASEAN's efforts and to demand the Myanmar military to immediately stop the violence, release all those detained, and promptly restore the democratic political system. Japan highly commends Bangladesh for generously accepting the displaced persons. It is vital to create an environment conducive to their safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation. Japan strongly hopes that the human rights and humanitarian situation in Myanmar will improve at the earliest possible date and in a manner that reflects the will of the people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Maldives for a video statement.
you, Madam President. The Maldives is deeply concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar, especially after the military coup. We call on the military to respect basic human rights and strongly condemn the use of force against civilians and call on the military to grant civil and political rights to the people of Myanmar, including the right to peaceful assembly and association. We are also concerned about the growing COVID-19 cases in Myanmar, which could possibly lead to a humanitarian health crisis. Madam President, the Maldives reiterates its concerns regarding the ongoing discrimination and human rights violations of the Rohingya and other minority groups in Myanmar and urges the Myanmar military to fully cooperate with the UN mechanism to return to civilian rule. We appreciate the ongoing efforts of the government of Bangladesh in responding to the needs of the thousands of Rohingya Muslims stranded in Bangladesh. We call on the international community to strengthen its efforts and actions towards ensuring their safe and dignified return. The Maldives stands in solidarity with the people of Myanmar, including with the Rohingya community, who continue to seek to return to democracy. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic on Zoom.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, as immediate neighbor and ASEAN fellow, the Lao PDA has been following the developments in Myanmar. We attest the importance of maintaining peace and stability in ASEAN member states to achieve a peaceful, stable, and prosperous ASEAN community. In this regard, we wish to reiterate the Lao PDA's support of the constructive and positive role of ASEAN in assisting Myanmar effort to return the situation in the country to the normalcy soon through the effective implementations of the 5-point consensus of ASEAN leaders. At the same time, we view that the international community should create a conducive environment for the parties concerned in Myanmar to resolve their internal differences by peaceful means with a view to restoring peace, stability in Myanmar, and to enabling Myanmar to continue its democratization process as well as national development. Madam President, last but not least, the participation of concerned countries in the interactive dialogue in the Human Rights Council is very crucial. Therefore, the Council shall be guided by the principle of the universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, and constructive international dialogue and cooperation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the United States for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your stark overview of the situation in Myanmar. The United States shares your concerns about the escalation in violence and the growing humanitarian crisis unfolding across the country. We are particularly concerned by credible reporting of enforced disappearances, torture and sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and other egregious human rights violations and abuses committed by Myanmar security forces. The military regime's continued brutal violence against the people of Myanmar must immediately cease, and those responsible must be held to account. The military regime's targeting of journalists and information access restrictions are deeply troubling, particularly given the pressing need for the people of Myanmar to remain informed about ongoing threats, including COVID-19. We urge the military to cease the use of violence and unjust detention against journalists, human rights defenders, and other advocates, and to promptly remove restrictions on the media and internet. Our question: what actions can we take to address the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar and improve access to information? Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Jordan on Zoom. Jordan, you have the floor. In that case, I will give the floor to Saudi Arabia for a video statement.
السيد الرئيس، يطيب الوفد بلادي أن يرحب بالمفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان السيدة ميشيل باشلت ويشكرها على الإحاطة الشفوية التي قدمتها حول حالة حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار. السيد الرئيس، تراقب حكومة بلادي الوضع انكثب في ميانمار وتعبر عن بالغ قلقها إزاء الأزمة الحالية التي أدت إلى تفاقم الوضع الإنساني وانعدام الأمن بالتزامن مع جائحة كورونا. وتدعو أصحاب المصلحة المعنيين على المستوى الوطني إلى نبذ العنف وحل هذه الأزمة من خلال الحفاظ على الحوار الوطني والالتزام بالتوصيات الدولية والأممية للحد من هذه الانتهاكات والتوصل إلى حل سلمي يضمن حماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان ويضع حد للإفلات من العقاب على جميع المتورطين في انتهاك القانون الدولي الإنساني. تؤكد حكومة بلادي على موقفها الثابت والداعم لحماية المدنيين والأقليات في ميانمار وخاصة مسلمي الروهينجا، وتدعو إلى ضمان سلامة أمنهم والاعتراف بحقوقهم الأساسية دون مزيد من التأخير، بما في ذلك الحق في المواطنة الكاملة وتهيئة الظروف لعودة آمنة وكريمة لهم. السيد الرئيس، تجدد حكومة بلادي دعوتها إلى تكثيف الجهود الدولية لمعالجة الأسباب الجذرية لهذه الأزمة واتخاذ كل ما من شأنه إيجاد حل عاجل ودائم يضمن سلامة وأمن مسلمي الروهينجا وغيرهم من الأقليات الأخرى. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to Malaysia on video statement.
Malaysia thanks Madam High Commissioner for her oral update and associates itself with the statement of the OIC. The situation in Myanmar continues to be of great concern to the international community and our region. Malaysia concurs with Madam High Commissioner that regional diplomacy must be intensified. Malaysia views the situation in Myanmar as an important matter for ASEAN to address together. In this regard, Malaysia wishes to reiterate its full support for the 5-point consensus reached at the ASEAN leaders meeting on Myanmar. We urge for de-escalation of the situation and cessation of the use of lethal violence against civilians. Forging an inclusive political dialogue involving all parties concerned is crucial. Towards this end, Malaysia calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi and U Win Min. A solution that respects the will and aspiration of the people of Myanmar is paramount. We also urge access for humanitarian assistance, including through ASEAN's AHA Center. Malaysia further hopes that the current situation in Myanmar will not have an adverse impact on the repatriation of displaced Rohingyas. Addressing the root causes as well as ensuring accountability is crucial in finding a sustainable solution to the Rohingya crisis. Malaysia will continue to support the ongoing efforts towards a safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced Rohingyas to their place of origin in the Rakhine State.
Thank you. I give the floor to Romania for a video statement.
Madam President, Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We would like to thank the High Commission for the oral update on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. The situation remains critical after the military coup of 1st February 2021 and the full range of violations of norms of international law and international humanitarian law that followed. We note with concern the increase in COVID-19 cases, which contributes to the further deterioration of the situation in Myanmar. Despite the strong reaction of the international community, the army continues the hard approach against civilian protests. Romania condemns in the stronger terms the action taken by the military against peaceful protesters, including the use of lethal force, arbitrary arrests and detentions, denial of access to aid, food and supplies to civilian populations and displaced persons. While welcoming the release of a number of political prisoners, we strongly request a return to the civilian rule, the release of all persons detained since the military coup, and the full respect of individual freedoms and human rights. We also request all those responsible for human rights violations to be held accountable, including the perpetrators and their chain of command. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland for a video statement.
Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. Ireland condemns in the strongest terms the coup in Myanmar, the numerous violations of human rights committed, and the continued use of lethal force and military weapons against civilians. As the High Commissioner has outlined, the situation in Myanmar continues to deteriorate. In addition to suppressing basic freedoms and arbitrarily detaining human rights defenders, the military have invoked martial law, imposed the death penalty, and are increasingly impeding humanitarian aid efforts. The risk of escalating conflict, deepening humanitarian crisis, and regional instability remains very real. Ireland is deeply concerned at the continuing reports of the harassment, abuse and killing of protesters, including women asserting their political right to participation, and is appalled by the reports of sexual violence and torture against detainees, as well as the detention of children. We renew our call on the military to immediately cease the use of force against their own people, release all political detainees, and guarantee the human rights of the people of Myanmar. We further emphasise that the Tatmadaw must at a minimum allow humanitarian actors to operate fully and in safety. Madam High Commissioner, given the slow pace of progress in fulfilling the promise of the ASEAN 5-point consensus, how can we best ensure that diplomatic efforts gain momentum? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the United Kingdom for a video statement.
Madam High Commissioner, for your update and for your continued effort as you fulfil your mandate. The United Kingdom continues to condemn the military coup in Myanmar, and I reiterate today our call on the military to respect the human rights of the people of Myanmar and their democratic wishes. The coup has had a detrimental impact on the freedom of speech. Over 80 journalists have been arrested and many others forced into a de facto exile. In many cases, there has been little or no information about their whereabouts, nor have they been provided access to lawyers. This is a clear attack on the rule of law and basic freedoms. Despite the many risks, independent media in Myanmar continue to play an essential role in exposing the actions of the junta. Journalism is not a crime. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained and call on the international community to continue to support independent media. In a crisis such as this, where the military regime seeks a monopoly of information, the role of the media is vital in combating propaganda and keeping alive the spirit of democracy. Supporting these platforms and the verified stories they share is a duty for all of us. Madam High Commissioner, what can the international community do to ensure that journalists are allowed to carry out their job without fear or threat of violence? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mauritania for a video statement.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيشكر وفدي المفوضة السامية على إحاطتها ويشاطرها مخاوفها المقلقة بالشأن الوضعي الخطير لحقوق الإنسان لمسلمي الروهينجا والأقليات الأخرى في ميانمار التي تتعرض لانتهاكات صارخة لحقوق الإنسان وجرائم خطيرة في تجاوز واضح لكل الأراضي والقوانين الدولية. كما يعبر وفدي عن تخوفه من أن تفاقم الأوضاع السياسية في ميانمار أزمة أكثر من 600 ألف من الروهينجا في البلاد، نحو 120 ألف منهم فعليا تقبع حبيسة المخيمات محرومة من حرية التنقل، إضافة إلى محدودية الوصول إلى الخدمات الصحية والتعليمية الأساسية. لقد أدت الأوضاع الاستثنائية في ميانمار إلى تعطيل سنوات من الجهود لمنع تفاقم الأزمة الإنسانية للروهينجا، كما أدت إلى تزايد أعداد النازحين في المناطق المتضررة من النزاع المسلح، وخاصة بالنسبة للفئات الأكثر ضعفا بما في ذلك الحوامل والأطفال وكبار السن. سيد الرئيس، في الختام يحث وفدي سلطات ميانمار على إزالة جميع القيود التعسفية على الروهينجا بما في ذلك القيود المفروضة على حرية التنقل والصحة والتعليم وسبل العيش والمساواة في الحصول على الجنسية، كما يدعوها إلى البدء فورا في إعادة آمنة وكريمة للروهينجا النازحين قسرا. شكرا سيدتي الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Marshall Islands for a video statement.
Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for her oral update on the human rights situation in Myanmar. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is concerned about the lack of humanitarian access, including cross-border delivery of humanitarian assistance to populations in need. In this regard, states must take urgent action to overcome this issue. Improving the situation on the ground will help to create conditions conducive to the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of those forcibly displaced. We highly commend the governments of Bangladesh and Thailand for hosting the refugees, and we urge the international community to assist in sharing the burden and facilitate cross-border assistance in order to minimize further displacements. In order to prevent further human rights violations in Myanmar, states should continue to urge the military in Myanmar to take conclusive steps to restore democracy and the rule of law. We urge the international community to lend support to the refugees fleeing the serious human rights violations in Myanmar, as well as the host nation of Bangladesh, which has been shouldering that burden for over 3 years now. Como dada, and I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Bulgaria for a video statement.
Distinguished Chairperson, Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update. Bulgaria is profoundly concerned about the continuing escalation of violence in Myanmar after the military coup and strongly condemns the use of heavy weaponry by the state security forces against civilians and public institutions, including Christian churches. We deplore the excessive and lethal force by the police against protesting people and the broad restrictions on media, public gatherings, freedom of expression, and freedom of peaceful assembly. Bulgaria is deeply worried about the growing number of refugees and IDPs that are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Creating conditions for the safe, voluntary, sustainable, and dignified return of all refugees and internally displaced persons is of key importance. There is urgent need to halt the ongoing violence and prevent even greater loss of life and aggravation of the humanitarian emergency. We underscore the need to restore the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as the rule of law in Myanmar. Bulgaria calls for the end of the state of emergency, the release of all political prisoners, the restoration of the parliament, and the legitimate civilian government. Bulgaria also calls for granting unhindered access to UN special procedures and humanitarian organizations, including the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ukraine on Zoom. I understand Ukraine is not in the room. I give the floor to the Netherlands for a video statement.
Madam Vice President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for the oral update on the human rights situation in Myanmar and reiterates its support for your efforts. The Netherlands is alarmed at recent acts of violence that illustrate a sharp deterioration of the human rights environment across Myanmar. Since our last gathering in March, we have seen further violent escalation throughout the country. The Netherlands reiterates its call on the military to ensure that international human rights norms and standards are respected. We firmly condemn any use of force against civilians, as well as the ongoing arrest and detention of protesters, politicians, civil society activists, journalists, and pro-democracy leaders, and call for their immediate and unconditional release. We stand in solidarity with those who risk their lives whilst openly and peacefully voicing their aspirations for a democratic future built on human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Netherlands calls for those responsible for human rights violations to be held accountable, and to this end support the work of the independent investigative mechanism of Myanmar. Madam High Commissioner, we are deeply concerned about the deteriorating human rights environment in Myanmar. What can be done to refrain from violence and increase dialogue amongst all parties? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Philippines for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. The Philippines' support for Myanmar's democratic transition has been unwavering. We have made repeated calls over the years prior to the events of February 1, 2021 for the Council to refrain from unilateralisms and to engage more constructively with the duly elected civilian government that was embarking on a fragile path. We support the restoration of the status quo ante. We call for the immediate release of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners. We urge Myanmar to swiftly implement the ASEAN 5-point consensus and invite states to support ASEAN initiatives. We are concerned about the escalation of violence that has claimed the lives of hundreds of civilians and state actors. The situation of the Rohingyas has worsened as armed groups have regained their foothold in Rakhine State. Our actions with respect to Myanmar must acknowledge that we cannot dissociate human rights from humanitarian, development, and security challenges. We must invest in strengthening the long-term resilience of institutions, communities, and the people of Myanmar. The Rosenthal report called for more coherence in the work of the UN system in Myanmar. We therefore ask the High Commissioner how the OHCHR and HRC can fit into the current UN-wide efforts in Myanmar, taking into account current developments as well as ASEAN efforts. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to India for a video statement.
Madam President, India thanks the High Commissioner for her oral update on the situation in Myanmar. India shares a long land and maritime border with Myanmar. As such, India has always accorded a high priority to maintenance of peace and stability in Myanmar and its economic development. India has been steadfast in its support to the process of democratic transition in Myanmar. We have expressed our deep concerns on developments in Myanmar, strongly condemned the use of violence, and urged maximum restraint. We have called for upholding the rule of law and release of political detainees. We are concerned at the impact of political instability in Myanmar and its spillover beyond Myanmar's border. We have been facing the situation of people crossing over the border into India. We call upon the leadership of Myanmar to work together to resolve their differences in a peaceful and constructive manner. Restoring democratic order should be the priority of all stakeholders. The international community must lend its constructive support to the people of Myanmar at this critical juncture. India welcomes the ASEAN initiative on Myanmar and the 5-point consensus. As a friend of the people of Myanmar, we'll continue with our people-centric projects and capacity-building initiatives and renew our initiatives to strengthen the democratic process in Myanmar. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. The Islamic Republic of Iran aligns itself with the statement delivered by Pakistan on behalf of the OIC. Iran continues to be deeply concerned over the plight of Rohingya Muslims of Myanmar, who remain among the most discriminated communities in the world. The fact that a huge number of Rohingya Muslims have been forced to flee their homeland and left stateless due to persistent persecution and massive violation of their basic human rights is extremely disturbing and appalling. We commend the ongoing efforts of Bangladesh in providing temporary shelter, humanitarian assistance, and protection to Rohingya Muslims, as well as is advocating for an end to massive rights abuse against them. We continue to call upon Myanmar authorities to fulfill their responsibility toward their people by protecting their human rights, putting an end to all violations, and by taking necessary remedial measures for justice. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Ukraine by video statement.
Madam President, we thank Madam High Commissioner for the oral update. Ukraine strongly condemns the military coup and the overthrow of the democratically elected government and remain deeply concerned about the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar. We call on the military to stop the repression against peaceful demonstrators immediately and unconditionally, including the use of lethal force, intimidation, harassment, and tortures. Violent response against peaceful protest is unacceptable. Ukraine calls for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained, including Myanmar's political leaders, civil society representatives, human rights advocates, journalists, and media workers, as well as to end the state of emergency and restore the rule of law. We are also deeply alarmed by the crackdown on freedom of opinion and expression, including the internet shutdowns, which severely restrict the access of the population to information. Ukraine joins the international community's call for safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to the most vulnerable population, as well as for the voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of the Rohingya and other minorities to Myanmar. We call upon the military and security forces to conduct transparent investigations into all allegations of human rights violations and abuses, as well as to ensure justice for victims and accountability for the perpetrators of such acts. Finally, I would like to reaffirm Ukraine's firm support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, and we will now turn to the list of speakers for non-government organizations, and I give the floor to the Asia Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Madam President, more than 5 months after the attempted coup, the Myanmar military has continued its murderous rampage throughout the country. The junta has killed over 890 people, while over 5,000 people are in detention. Abductions of family members of protest leaders and activists evading arrest by the junta have come yet another feature of its brutality. These include the detention of Sutat Wine, a 4-year-old girl, her 17-year-old sister who is seriously ill, and their mother, as the junta could not find to arrest her father. Women and girls continue to bear the brunt of the military's nationwide terror campaign. Survivor accounts point to alarming levels of sexual violence in detention. Intensified military assaults in Kachin, Karen, Karenni, Shan, and Chin states have led to widespread displacements and crimes against humanity and war crimes, and renewed fears of sexual violence. Myanmar military's long-established pattern of use of rape and sexual violence as weapons of war is well documented. We urge the High Commissioner to closely monitor the disproportionate violence and brutality inflicted on women, children, LGBTIQ persons, and women HRDs. Myanmar people have clearly rejected the junta. We urge the Council and the international community to do the same and take all necessary steps to end the ongoing assault on the people and to hold the junta accountable for its grave crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Edmund Rice International.
President, we thank the High Commissioner for her update. The human rights and humanitarian situation in Myanmar is of utmost concern. Since February 2021, violence is escalating and the number of IDPs is increasing. The recent fighting between the military forces and the People's Defence Force in the Demorso and Mobai regions has caused entire populations to flee to other parts of the country in extreme conditions with very limited access to food and without clean water and sanitation. Basic healthcare services are also restricted, although urgently needed, especially in regions where fighting is taking place. Medical doctors and government staff who join the civil disobedience movement and humanitarian organisations are arrested, tortured, disappeared, and even murdered. Humanitarian protection is critical in this context, and access to vulnerable communities must be granted. Funding is another major concern due to limited availability of cash and challenges faced with bank transfers. Limited funding, along with internet shutdown, are hampering the humanitarian response and the ability to support vulnerable people. Finally, we urge governments imposing sanctions to take all necessary measures to avoid any unintended negative impacts on the population and on the ability of humanitarian organisations and local actors to provide aid to people in need of life-saving assistance. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Centre CCPR.
Madam President, Member of the Human Rights Council, Madam High Commissioner, since the coup by the Myanmar military on 1st of February 2021, the situation on the ground is deteriorating day by day. Nearly 900 persons are killed, including children and medical staff, and thousands of persons arbitrarily detained by the military that has been blatantly ignoring the rule of law and committing grave violation of human rights. As specified in our written statement to the Council, we are highly alerted by a series of Tatmando's action, including arbitrary and illegitimate amendments of law that increasingly undermines the rule of law. Madam High Commissioner, we appreciate your tireless efforts in monitoring the situation and recommended required actions. However, as the UN's Special Envoy on Myanmar told the General Assembly in June, the risk of a large-scale civil war is real. Decisive, coordinated and targeted measures must be taken now by all countries and UN bodies to save lives and rights of millions of people in Myanmar. The sovereignty of Myanmar lies with the people of Myanmar. The legitimacy of the National Unity Government of Myanmar to represent the country in this juncture must be duly recognized by the UN General Assembly. Madam High Commissioner, people in Myanmar are suffering. Postponing actions of the UN bodies does not solve anything. What can you and your office do to enable immediate and effective action from this Council without waiting for the decision from the General Assembly? Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Article 19.
Commissioner for her oral update and her ongoing efforts to monitor and assess the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar. We look forward to her written update and comprehensive report. We are deeply concerned about the arrest of journalists, lawyers, and participants in the civil disobedience movement and allegations of torture and detention. We request the High Commissioner to monitor and assess all instances of detention, taking into account the experiences of women, children, LGBTQI individuals, and ethnic and religious minorities. Internet shutdowns continue to hamper accountability efforts and contribute to human rights violations. We urge the High Commissioner to examine the internet restrictions in Myanmar, including how they have enabled violations of international human rights law and international criminal law. We remain concerned about the junta's increased surveillance capabilities and urge the High Commissioner to scrutinize the military's use of digital surveillance technologies to violate human rights. The junta's increased restrictions on banking operations and scrutiny of non-governmental organizations has had a devastating impact on civil society, forcing many groups to go underground, leave the country, or cease operations altogether. We urge the High Commissioner to investigate these restrictions and to provide concrete recommendations to member states and UN entities on best practices in supporting civil society. Thank you.
I thank you. And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate at this meeting. The interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Myanmar will continue tomorrow at noon. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her participation at this meeting. I understand that certain delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Turkey is using its right of reply regarding the unfounded accusations made by the representatives of Armenia and Greece. Instead of giving account for the occupation lasted nearly 30 years in Nagorno-Karabakh and the crimes against humanity and war crimes committed during this occupation, Armenia tries to deflect its responsibilities into Turkey with unfounded and unrealistic allegations. We categorically reject them. On the other hand, it is common knowledge that Armenia deployed Syria-based PKK-YPG terrorists and ethnic Armenians from third countries to Nagorno-Karabakh. We urge Armenia to stop abusing and politicizing this platform in order to repeat its baseless allegations. There is now a historic opportunity for a sustainable peace in Nagorno-Karabakh, and we hope that Armenia will choose to be a partner of peace and stability in the region. Turkey will reciprocate any positive step taken by Armenia. We also categorically reject the baseless claims of Greece. Child recruitment is a continued practice of PKK-YPG and a violation that has been well documented by relevant UN agencies. We recommend Greece to check these reports first. We would like to remind that Greece has never complied with its obligations under the international law and pushed back more than 80,000 refugees in recent years. Most of them were Syrians. Therefore, Greece has no moral ground to accuse or lecture other countries before the international community. Turkey is hosting about 3.6 million Syrian refugees of different age, gender, religion, ethnicity, including 300,000 Syrian Kurds who could not return to their home because of the presence of PKK-YPG in northern Syria. As a country taking care of about 5 million civilians on the other side of its border, Turkey is more than concerned about the water situation in the region, particularly in the Euphrates. Our region is experiencing one of the worst droughts of our times, caused by the climate change and global warming. We are witnessing record high reduction of water flow on the Euphrates. Despite that, the average amount of water released by Turkey from the Euphrates to downstream regions in the first half of this year has been over 500 cubic meters per second. Under any circumstances, Turkey has never used water for political or any other purposes. We will continue to approach the water issue from a humanitarian perspective. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And this was the only speaker on my list. Is there any other delegation requesting to exercise the right of reply in relation to statements made during the day? And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece. You have the floor. You have 3 minutes. Greece, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Madam President. I would like to take the floor with reference to Turkey's right of reply. We are surprised by the fact that Turkey chose to reply so vehemently to a statement which only mentioned facts that have been well documented by the COI and other authorities and thus can't be considered as partial when it comes to violations. We clearly stated that we must remain firm in condemning international humanitarian and international human rights law violations and abuses be they committed by the Syrian authorities or by any of the other parties to the conflict. While all parties have not committed an equal number of violations, Turkey seems to think that the violations it bears responsibility for are less significant than other parties' crimes. The COI reports, and especially the last ones, are adamant that Turkey has legal responsibilities following the launch of its illegal operations in Syria. They underscore Turkey's role regarding areas under the control of its affiliate Syrian National Army, where Syrian nationals, including women who were detained by the Syrian National Army in Afrin and Ras Al Ain, were subsequently transferred to Turkey, with most of them remaining detained there, something which may amount to the war crime of unlawful deportation of protected persons, and enforced disappearances when Turkey doesn't provide information on their whereabouts. Furthermore, accounts indicate that Turkish forces and officers were regularly present in Syrian National Army detention facilities, including in the military police headquarters and the prison in Hawar Kilis, locations where ill treatment of detainees was rampant. 4 former detainees reported that Turkish officials were present during interrogation sessions when torture was used. By failing to intervene to prevent torture when present or otherwise aware that torture would be employed, Turkish forces may have violated their obligations under the 4th Geneva Convention. There are many other references that we could have included in this reply, but have not for the sake of time. We have them at our disposal should our esteemed Turkish colleague want us to further freshen its memory. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Armenia requested the floor to exercise its right of reply to Turkey. While Turkey denied that Syrian mercenaries were employed in the recent war of aggression Azerbaijan launched against Nagorno-Karabakh, there have been plenty of evidence widely covered by the international mass media, reported and analyzed by civil society organizations, as well as, last but not in no way least, confirmed by the leaders of several states and heads of their intelligence services. French President Emmanuel Macron, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, head of the Russian SVR External Intelligence Service, Sergei Naryshkin, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas have been among them, if we are to name a few. As early as August of 2020, the rumors started to circulate in the Turkish-controlled areas of northern Syria that there was well-paid work to be had overseas. People were lured into it by lucrative promises of a good to be sentries at checkpoints in Azerbaijan. The promised remuneration offered was $2,000 per month, which was a fortune for civil war and poverty-stricken country. Furthermore, 2 Syrian mercenaries have been detained during the military hostilities and have been tried in a duly held process. The whole process of their recruitment and trafficking to Azerbaijan through Turkish territory on board of Turkish military transport aircraft has been well traced and documented. The most appalling part of their testimony was about the promise of an additional $100 bounty for a decapitated head of an infidel Armenian. Civil society researchers have amassed considerable amount of evidence drawn from videos and photographs the Syrian recruited fighters have posted themselves online. A number of videos filmed by men speaking Syrian Arabic who identified the factions with which they were affiliated with had been geolocated to southern front of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Further video and imagery shown men identified as Syrians in the Azerbaijani border service fatigues. In addition to this, numerous researchers and media outlets have collected testimony from fighters in Azerbaijan themselves, as well as from their family members. We remind Azerbaijan and Turkey that recruitment, use, financing, or training of mercenaries is an offense under international law, as it is established by the International Convention against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries. It is our conviction that the recruitment and transfer are violations of human rights and should be treated as such. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan. You have 3 minutes. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. I'm exercising my right to reply to the statement delivered by the representative of Armenia. Azerbaijan rejects the unfounded, baseless accusations by Armenia on the use of foreign terrorist fighters and mercenaries in the recent hostilities, and we stress that Armenia brazenly accuses Azerbaijan of the same to divert the attention from its own wrongdoings. Analysis of video and photo materials presented by Armenia to substantiate its claims proves that they are nothing but prefabricated falsifications. In contrary, Azerbaijan's reports submitted to HCHR on the use of foreign terrorist fighters by Armenia in its recent aggression against Azerbaijan contains factual evidences with real photo and private data of the terrorist fighters. Throughout years of occupation and intensified immediately after the Armenian aggression, Armenia undertook extensive transfer to and trainings of the foreign terrorist fighters from the Middle East in the training camps established in then-occupied territories of Azerbaijan under the guidance of PKK and Assawa, terrorist organizations who were subsequently engaged in the war against Azerbaijan. With the support of Armenian diaspora organizations operating under the cover of charity entities, Armenia has also widely used fundraising campaigns such as We Are Our Borders, Armenia Fund, One Armenia Fund, to name just a few, to recruit foreign terrorist fighters and mercenaries against Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other delegation requesting to exercise the right of reply in relation to statements made during the day? I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Armenia to exercise the second right of reply. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Armenia requested the floor to exercise its second right of reply to Azerbaijan. There have been varying estimates about the exact death toll suffered by the Syrian fighters in the armed hostilities unleashed by Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based group that monitors the conflict in Syria, puts the figure at more than 500. According to the most conservative expert estimates, there have been no less than 3,000 Syrian fighters participating in hostilities on the side of Azerbaijan. Indeed, Azerbaijan denies the use of mercenaries, as it had denied the use of foreign terrorist fighters against Nagorno-Karabakh back in 1990s. However, the facts are stubborn things, and the headlines of the international media back in 1990s as well as now speak for themselves. The usual answer that Azerbaijan gives to such evidences is that they are fake news. The same answer they gave when the Armenian churches were deliberately targeted by precision weapons. They added an insult to an injury by saying that it may have been a mistake or a provocation by Armenia. Rest assured that Armenia will be after the perpetrators and will spare no effort in taking advantage of all possible and available international avenues for the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for these gross violations of the international law. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan to exercise the second right of reply. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, dear Madam President. I'm taking the floor to exercise my delegation's second right of reply. And, as we have told in previous meetings, time and again, at the current session of the Council, Armenia resorts to uselessly engage in repeating absolutely the same propaganda against Azerbaijan, and under each item of this Council's meeting. And we reiterate our call to Armenia to come down to earth and to try to grasp the current situation emerged in the region in the aftermath of signing of the trilateral statement on November 10, 2020. We again remind Armenia, Azerbaijan has effectively restored its territorial integrity and sovereignty over its internationally recognized territories by enforcing Armenia to peace. Nagorno-Karabakh conflict does not exist any longer and went to the history.
If Armenia is genuinely interested to be a part of regional peace building and to benefit from opportunities emerging in the region, including perspectives for normalization of interstate relations between the two nations on the basis of respect of each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and viability of international borders, it should spare no time and efforts to fulfill its obligations under the trilateral statements of 10 November 2020 and 11 January 2021 in a good faith. Armenia must refrain from any destabilizing actions and statements aimed at undermining the emerging perspectives for regional peace and security, such as the deployment of a sabotage group into the territories of Azerbaijan, frequent border provocations, and refusal to release the maps of mined areas in accordance with obligations under the international humanitarian law that continue to cause serious threats to lives and safety of Azerbaijani population and affect the realization of inalienable right of displaced Azerbaijani population to be returned to their homes in safety and dignity and in judicious reform. I thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other delegation requesting the right of reply? I understand that there are none. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the quadrennial panel discussion on promoting human rights through sport and the Olympic ideal, followed by the resumed interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, as well as the presentation of the report of the Forum on Business and Human Rights under Item 5. I hereby close the 24th meeting of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council.